Welcome. I'm so glad you've joined me for this exploration into one of the most fascinating aspects of our daily lives, the science of how we are influenced and how we influence others. Have you ever found yourself saying yes to a request, a purchase, or a commitment, only to wonder a few minutes later why you did it? Or perhaps you felt a strange, internal pressure to return a favor to someone you don't even particularly like. If these situations feel familiar, you aren't alone. In fact, you're experiencing the results of deeply embedded psychological triggers that guide much of our decision-making process. Today, we are diving deep into the definitive work on this subject, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, written by Robert Cialdini. The main purpose of this book is to pull back the curtain on the weapons of influence, the specific psychological principles that compliance professionals, like salespeople, fundraisers, and advertisers, use to get us to agree to their requests. By understanding these triggers, we move from being passive participants in these interactions to becoming more aware and empowered decision makers. As we go through this journey, we'll be focusing on a few high-level ideas that form the backbone of the book's research. First, we'll look at the idea of fixed action patterns, which are essentially mental shortcuts or automatic responses that we all have. These shortcuts are usually helpful because they allow us to navigate a complex world without overthinking every single detail, but they can also be exploited. Second, we will explore the 6 principles of persuasion, the core psychological pillars that govern our impulse to comply. These include things like our need to return favors, our desire to be consistent with what we've said in the past, and our tendency to look to others when we aren't sure how to behave. The goal here isn't just to learn how others might try to manipulate us, but to understand the fundamental mechanics of human interaction. This knowledge is a tool for better communication and a shield for your own autonomy. It's about recognizing the difference between a genuine request and a calculated psychological tactic. I think you'll find that once you see these principles in action, you'll start noticing them everywhere, from the grocery store aisles to the highest levels of business and politics. Before we get started with the main summary and break down these fascinating concepts, I'd like to ask you to please like this audio, share it with someone who might find it useful, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future deep dives into the books that shape our world. Main summary: the mechanics of persuasion. The click-word mechanism, our automatic responses. To truly understand how persuasion works, we have to start with how the human brain processes information. The book explains that humans, much like other animals, have evolved certain fixed action patterns. Think of these as pre-programmed behaviors that are triggered by a single piece of information. The author refers to this as the click-word response. The click is the trigger, and the word is the automatic sequence of behaviors that follows. This idea is important because it highlights that we often don't use all the information available to us when making a decision. Instead, we use a single trigger feature to save time and mental energy. In our modern, fast-paced world, we are constantly bombarded with information. If we had to analyze every single aspect of every choice, we would be paralyzed by indecision. So, we rely on these shortcuts. For example, many of us operate under the mental rule that expensive equals good. When we see a high price tag, it clicks a trigger in our minds that automatically whirs us into the belief that the item is of high quality, even if we haven't actually inspected it. While these shortcuts usually work in our favor, they create a vulnerability. Compliance professionals know exactly which triggers to pull to get the response they want. They don't have to convince us with logic, they just have to provide the right trigger. A classic experiment mentioned involves a person trying to cut in line at a photocopy machine. When they simply asked to cut, they had moderate success. But when they added the word because, even if the reason following it was totally redundant, like because I have to make copies, compliance jumped significantly. The word because acted as the click, triggering an automatic word of agreement from the people in line. Now we move to the next point, where we transition from these general automatic triggers to the first and perhaps most powerful specific principle of influence, the rule of reciprocation. The rule of reciprocation, the old give and take. The rule of reciprocation is one of the most potent weapons of influence in the human arsenal. Simply put, this rule states that we should try to repay, in kind, what another person has provided for us. If someone does us a favor, we feel a strong psychological obligation to return that favor in the future. This sense of indebtedness is so deeply ingrained in our culture that the author suggests it may have been a vital evolutionary advantage, allowing early humans to share resources and skills with the confidence that they would eventually be repaid. This principle is important because it is incredibly difficult to resist. The feeling of owing someone is a heavy psychological burden that most of us want to get rid of as quickly as possible. Because of this, the rule can often be used to trigger a yes even from people who don't particularly like the person making the request. The favor doesn't even have to be something we asked for. An uninvited favor can still create a sense of obligation. We see this in action frequently in marketing and social interactions. Consider the free sample at a supermarket. While it seems like a simple gift, it often triggers a feeling of obligation to buy the product, even if we didn't particularly enjoy the taste. The small, free gift makes us feel like we owe the salesperson something, and the easiest way to discharge that debt is to make a purchase. The power of this rule is that the return favor can often be much larger than the initial gift. We are so uncomfortable with the feeling of debt that we are willing to agree to a much larger request just to be free of the obligation. Another variation of this is the rejection then retreat tactic. Here, a person starts by making a very large request that they know you will probably turn down. After you say no, they make a smaller, concessionary request. Because they appear to have made a concession to you, you feel a reciprocal obligation to make a concession to them, which usually results in you saying yes to the smaller request, which was their goal all along. Now we move to the next point, shifting our focus from how we interact with others to how we strive for internal harmony through commitment and consistency. Commitment and consistency, the hobgoblin of the mind. The third major principle we need to understand is our nearly obsessive desire to be, and to appear, consistent with what we have already done or said. Once we make a choice or take a stand, we encounter personal and interpersonal pressures to behave consistently with that commitment. This drive for consistency is a powerful motivator because, in most societies, being consistent is viewed as a positive trait associated with logic, rationality, and stability. In contrast, being inconsistent is often seen as being two-faced or mentally confused. The importance of this principle lies in the fact that it allows us to stop thinking about an issue once we've made a decision. We don't have to weigh the pros and cons anymore, we just have to look at our previous commitment and act accordingly. This automatic consistency acts as a shield against the effort of constant thought, but it also means we can be easily led into behaviors that are not in our best interest if someone can get us to make a small initial commitment. The foot in the door technique is a prime example of this. It involves getting a person to agree to a very small, seemingly insignificant request. Once that person has agreed, they have established a self-image of being a cooperative person or someone who cares about a particular cause. Later, when a much larger request is made that is related to that small initial act, the person is much more likely to agree because they want their actions to stay consistent with that new self-image they've created. For instance, if a neighborhood group asks you to sign a tiny petition for keeping the city clean, you might think nothing of it and sign. However, 2 weeks later, if they ask you to put a large, unsightly billboard in your front yard for the same cause, you are statistically far more likely to say yes than if they had just asked for the billboard first. Your brain wants to maintain the consistency of being a supporter of a clean city, even if the cost of that consistency has suddenly become much higher. The next major pillar of influence is social proof. This principle states that we determine what is correct by finding out what other people think is correct. This is especially true when it comes to behavior. We view a behavior as more correct in a given situation to the degree that we see others performing it. Whether it is deciding what to do with an empty soda can, how fast to drive on a certain stretch of highway, or how to eat the chicken at a formal dinner, the actions of those around us are vital in defining our own choices. This idea is incredibly important because it provides a convenient shortcut for navigating life. Usually, if a lot of people are doing something, it is the right thing to do. This allows us to make decisions quickly without having to analyze every situation from scratch. However, the author points out that this principle is most powerful under two specific conditions: uncertainty and similarity. When we are unsure of ourselves or when the situation is ambiguous, we are most likely to look to and accept the actions of others as correct. Furthermore, we are most likely to follow the lead of someone who is similar to us. The danger of social proof is that it can lead to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. This happens in situations where everyone is looking to everyone else to see what to do, but since no one is acting, everyone assumes that nothing is wrong. This can have serious consequences in emergency situations where a crowd of people might stand by and do nothing, not because they are unkind, but because they are looking for a cue from others that doesn't exist. We see social proof used constantly in the world of commerce. For example, television producers have long used canned laughter or recorded laugh tracks. Even though we know the laughter is fake and often find it annoying, research shows that it causes us to laugh longer and more often, and to rate the material as funnier. Our brains are conditioned to respond to the click of others laughing with the whir of our own amusement, even when the trigger is obviously manufactured. Now we move to the next point, where we look at how our personal feelings toward the person making a request can bypass our critical thinking. Moving from the collective influence of the crowd, we now focus on the individual power of rapport. Liking, the friendly thief. The principle of liking is deceptively simple. We prefer to say yes to the requests of people we know and like. While this seems obvious, what is fascinating is how compliance professionals use this principle to get us to agree to things by making themselves likable in very specific, calculated ways. The author identifies several factors that reliably cause us to like someone, often without us realizing it's happening. The first factor is physical attractiveness. There is a halo effect where we automatically assign positive traits like talent, kindness, and intelligence to good-looking people. Second is similarity. We like people who are like us, whether that's in terms of opinions, personality traits, background, or even lifestyle. Third is compliments. We are phenomenal suckers for flattery, and even when we know someone is trying to manipulate us with praise, we tend to like them for it anyway. Finally, there is contact and cooperation. We like things and people that are familiar to us, especially if we have worked with them toward a common goal. The importance of the liking principle is that it creates a sense of trust and connection that makes us less likely to scrutinize the request being made. If we like the person, we want to help them, and we don't want to disappoint them. This emotional connection can easily override our rational judgment about the value or necessity of the deal being offered. A very clear example of this is the good cop/bad cop routine used by interrogators. The bad cop creates a sense of fear and hostility. When the good cop steps in to support you and protect you from the other officer, you immediately perceive them as a friend and ally. Because you like this person who seems to be on your side, you are far more likely to cooperate and provide the information they are looking for, even though they are still a representative of the same organization trying to build a case against you. Now we move to the next point, shifting from the emotional pull of liking to the structural power of perceived expertise and status. As we've seen, our feelings for a person matter, but our respect for their position can be just as influential. Authority, the pressure of deferential obedience. The principle of authority focuses on our deep-seated sense of duty to those we perceive as being in positions of power or expertise. From a very young age, we are taught that obedience to proper authority is right and disobedience is wrong. This is generally a functional way for a society to operate, as it allows for specialized knowledge to guide those without it. We trust doctors, judges, and experts because their positions usually suggest they have a level of knowledge or wisdom that we do not. However, the importance of this principle lies in how easily it can be faked. Our brains often don't look for actual authority, but rather for the symbols of authority. The author notes 3 types of symbols that are particularly effective: titles, clothing, and trappings. A person with a title like doctor or professor, or someone wearing a business suit or a uniform, is often granted a level of compliance that they haven't necessarily earned through their actions. We respond to the status, not the person. This automatic deference to authority can lead us to perform actions that go against our own moral compass or common sense. When we are in the presence of an authority figure, we often stop thinking for ourselves and simply follow instructions. This blind obedience is a shortcut that saves us the trouble of making difficult decisions, but it also removes our sense of personal responsibility for the outcome. Think about how pharmaceutical advertisements often feature actors wearing white lab coats. These actors aren't actually doctors, and often there's a small disclaimer stating this fact. Yet, the presence of the lab coat, a powerful symbol of medical authority, is enough to make the audience view the product with more trust and credibility. The symbol alone triggers a awe of respect and compliance, making us more likely to believe the claims being made about the medication. Now we move to the next point, which is the final of the original 6 principles. We will look at how the perceived availability of something can drastically change its value in our eyes. Scarcity, the rule of the few. The principle of scarcity is based on the idea that opportunities seem more valuable to us when their availability is limited. If we think we might lose out on something, we want it significantly more. This principle works on 2 levels. First, we use availability as a shortcut for quality. If something is hard to get, it's usually because it's better than the things that are easy to get. Second, as things become less available, we lose freedoms, and we hate to lose the freedom of choice. The importance of scarcity is tied to a psychological concept called reactance. When our ability to have something is threatened, we react by wanting that item even more than we did before. We don't just want the item for its utility, we want it because we feel the need to win back our freedom to possess it. This creates an emotional arousal that makes it very difficult for us to think calmly and rationally about whether we actually need the thing in question. The author notes that scarcity is most effective when 2 conditions are met. First, when the item has recently become scarce. We value things that have just moved from plenty to few more than things that have always been scarce. And second, when we are in competition with others for it. The combination of limited supply and high demand creates a feeding frenzy that can bypass all logical thought. A classic example of this is the limited time offer or the while supplies last tactic used by retailers. By creating an artificial deadline or suggesting that stock is running low, they force you to make a decision quickly. Because you are afraid of losing the opportunity to buy, you don't take the time to compare prices or consider if you truly need the item. The fear of loss is a much more powerful motivator than the prospect of gain. Now we move to the next point, where we explore a newer but equally fundamental aspect of persuasion that focuses on our shared identities and the feeling of we-ness. In more recent updates to his research, the author introduced a 7th principle known as unity. While the principle of liking is about finding common ground or rapport, unity goes much deeper. It is about a shared identity, the sense that a person is one of us. When we perceive someone as belonging to the same group as we do, the traditional rules of influence are amplified to an incredible degree. The importance of unity lies in our biological and social evolution. Humans are tribal creatures. For most of our history, our survival depended on the success and cohesion of our group. Therefore, we are hardwired to be more trusting, more helpful, and more compliant with members of our own tribe, whether that tribe is defined by family, nationality, political affiliation, or even a shared hobby. When the we is invoked, the distinction between the self and the other begins to blur. We don't just help the other person because we like them, we help them because, in a way, we are helping ourselves. There are 2 primary ways this unity is created. The first is being together, which refers to shared heritage or kinship. We are naturally most influenced by our family members. However, this can be extended to fictive kinship, where groups use family-based language, like brothers or sisters, to trigger those same deep-seated loyalties. The second way is acting together. When people engage in synchronous activity, like marching, singing, or even just working together on a collaborative project, they experience a psychological merging. This co-creation makes them far more likely to agree with one another later on. A powerful example of this is found in the way some companies approach their shareholders. Instead of just sending a standard report, a CEO might ask shareholders for their advice on a specific direction for the company. By asking for advice rather than just an opinion, the CEO invites the shareholders into a state of unity. They are now co-creators of the company's future. Because they feel they have acted together with the leadership, they become significantly more supportive and less critical of the company's subsequent decisions. Now we move to the next point, where we shift our focus from understanding these tactics to learning how we can defend ourselves against them in our daily lives. The defense, neutralizing the weapons of influence. It is not enough to simply know that these principles exist, we must also know how to disarm them when they are being used against us. The book emphasizes that we shouldn't try to avoid these shortcuts entirely. They are, after all, necessary for navigating a complex world. Instead, our goal should be to recognize when the trigger is being pulled artificially by someone who wants to exploit us. Each principle has its own specific defense mechanism, a way to hit the brakes on our automatic response. For the rule of reciprocation, the defense is to accept the initial favor for what it is, a gift, but to be ready to redefine it as a sales tactic if it is followed by a request. If we realize the favor was actually a trick to get us to buy something, the sense of obligation vanishes. We don't owe anything to a trickster. For commitment and consistency, the defense is to listen to our gut and our heart of hearts. If we feel a physical tightening in our stomach when we are about to agree to something, it's often a sign that we are being trapped by our own desire for consistency. In those moments, it's okay to point out the absurdity of the situation and refuse to be consistent for the sake of consistency. When dealing with social proof, we must learn to recognize when the crowd is being faked, like canned laughter, or when the crowd is simply wrong, like pluralistic ignorance. We should always do a quick fact check to see if the actions of others actually make sense in the current context. To defend against the liking principle, we should separate the requester from the request. If we find ourselves liking a salesperson far more than we should after only a few minutes of interaction, that is a red flag. We must force ourselves to make the decision based solely on the merits of the deal, not on how much we like the person offering it. To neutralize the authority principle, we should ask ourselves two questions: is this authority truly an expert, and how truthful can we expect this expert to be? By focusing on the authority's actual credentials and their potential for personal gain, we strip away the power of their symbols, like titles or clothing. Finally, to combat scarcity, we must remember that the scarce item won't taste, feel, or work any better just because it is hard to find. When we feel that rush of scarcity-driven excitement, we should take a deep breath and ask ourselves why we wanted the item in the first place. Was it for its utility, or just to possess it? Now we move to the next point, where we consider the broader implications of these principles in the context of our modern, fast-paced society. Instant influence, primitive consent in a high-tech age. The final core concept of the book is the idea that we are living in an era where we rely more on these shortcuts than ever before. We live in a world of information overload. The sheer volume of data, choices, and stimuli we face every day is unprecedented in human history. Paradoxically, as our technology becomes more sophisticated and our access to information grows, our ability to process that information in a deep, rational way actually decreases. We simply don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to be fully rational all the time. This importance of this trend is that it makes us more like our primitive ancestors who relied on simple triggers to survive. We are increasingly forced to use the click-word response just to get through the day. Because of this, the 6 or 7 principles of influence are becoming more powerful, not less. We are moving into a future where automaticity is the norm. We rely on this trigger feature because we have no other choice. However, the author issues a stern warning about the shortcuts we use. These mental shortcuts are a vital part of our cognitive equipment. They are not the problem. The problem is the profiteer who mimics the triggers of those shortcuts to deceive us. When someone fakes social proof with a laugh track or fakes authority with a costume, they are essentially polluting the environment of our decision-making process. They are making our shortcuts, which we need to survive, unreliable. Because of this, the author argues that we have a right, and perhaps even a duty, to fight back against those who misuse the principles of influence. When we encounter someone who is using these tactics in a dishonest or manipulative way, we should not just walk away, we should actively point out the deception. By doing so, we help preserve the integrity of the mental shortcuts that we all rely on to function in a modern, complex world. Now we move to the next point, where we explore a fundamental psychological concept that often acts as the silent partner to all the other principles of influence, the contrast principle. This principle affects the way we perceive the difference between two things that are presented one after another. Simply put, if the second item is fairly different from the first, we will tend to see it as even more different than it actually is. This is not a conscious choice, it's a distortion in our mental weighting system that happens automatically. The importance of the contrast principle lies in its subtlety and its near-universal application. It doesn't require a request or a favor to work, it simply requires a specific sequence of events. When a compliance professional uses this, they are essentially priming your perception so that the final offer looks much more attractive than it would have in isolation. Because the comparison happens so quickly in our minds, we rarely realize that our judgment has been skewed by the initial experience. A classic example from the book involves a real estate tactic called setup properties. A broker might take a potential buyer to a couple of houses that are in poor condition and clearly overpriced. These are not houses the broker expects to sell, they are setup houses. After seeing these rundown properties, the broker then shows the buyer a real house, one that is in decent condition and reasonably priced. Compared to the first two dumps, the third house looks like an incredible bargain, even if it might be objectively average. The contrast makes the third house shine, and the buyer feels a strong urge to act before someone else snaps up such a great deal. This principle is also a staple in the clothing industry. If a man enters a high-end suit store, the salesperson will almost always try to sell him the expensive suit first. Once he has agreed to spend a large sum of money on the suit, the prices of accessories, like a belt, a tie, or a shirt, seem relatively small and insignificant by comparison. If the salesperson had tried to sell the $100 tie first, it might have seemed expensive. But compared to a $1,000 suit, the $100 tie feels like a minor add-on. Now we move to the next point, as we look deeper into the biological and social roots of why we resist being told no, particularly during certain formative stages of our lives. Psychological reactance, the Romeo and Juliet effect. Building on our earlier discussion of scarcity, we must look at the psychological engine that drives our desire for things that are forbidden or restricted, psychological reactance. This theory explains that whenever our free choice is limited or threatened, the need to retain our freedoms makes us want them significantly more than before. This is not just about wanting a product, it's about a visceral reaction to the loss of autonomy. The author notes that this trait emerges strongly at two specific ages, the terrible twos and the teenage years. The importance of understanding reactance is that it explains why banning or censoring something often backfires. When information is restricted, we don't just want it more, we also tend to believe it more. We assume that if someone is trying to hide information from us, that information must be particularly valuable or true. This creates a situation where the act of restriction actually gives the forbidden item or idea more power and credibility than it ever had when it was freely available. The book illustrates this with what is called the Romeo and Juliet effect. The intense passion of the two famous lovers is often attributed to the extreme parental interference they faced. Research into modern teenage romances suggests a similar pattern. When parents interfere or try to forbid a relationship, the couple's feelings for each other often intensify, and their desire for marriage increases. Rather than breaking the couple apart, the pressure acts as a catalyst that bonds them tighter in a shared struggle to maintain their freedom of choice. This reaction is so predictable that it can be exploited. If someone wants you to do something, they might pretend to forbid it, knowing that your natural reactance will drive you toward the very behavior they desire. This is why limited edition bans or adults-only warnings are so effective at attracting interest. The moment a door is closed, our primary instinct is to see what's behind it, regardless of whether we were interested in the first place. Now we move to the next point, where we revisit a classic case study from the book that demonstrates the raw power of these principles when they are applied systematically by an organization. The Hare Krishna strategy, exploiting the rule of reciprocation. One of the most famous examples Robert Cialdini uses to illustrate the practical power of influence is the fundraising strategy of the Hare Krishna Society. In the 1970s, this group faced a significant problem. Their public image was not favorable, and people were often unwilling to contribute to them. To overcome this, they stopped asking for donations directly and instead began using a strategy based on the rule of reciprocation. The importance of this case study is that it shows how a gift can be used as a weapon to force a sense of obligation, even in people who are actively trying to avoid the interaction. The Krishnas would target travelers in busy airports, not by asking for money, but by pressing a gift into their hands, usually a flower or a book. Even if the traveler tried to refuse or give it back, the Krishna member would insist, "No, this is our gift to you." Only after the gift was accepted would the request for a donation be made. The result was a massive increase in funding. People who were annoyed by the group and had no interest in their cause felt a powerful psychological pressure to give a few dollars simply because they were holding a flower they didn't want. The gift created a debt that had to be repaid. The travelers felt they couldn't just walk away with the flower, as that would violate the social rule of reciprocation. Eventually, the public became wise to this tactic, and airports began posting signs or banning the practice. But the lesson remains: the rule of reciprocation is so strong that it can force us into an exchange we never wanted, with a person we don't like, for a cause we don't support. It is a reminder that we must be wary of gifts that come with an unspoken price tag, as they are often the first step in a calculated attempt to gain our compliance. As we come to the end of our journey through Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on the landscape we've traveled. We began by looking at the click-word mechanism, those automatic, pre-programmed responses that allow us to function in an increasingly complex environment. We've seen how Robert Cialdini identified the core principles that trigger these responses: reciprocation, commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, authority, scarcity, and the newly integrated principle of unity. These principles are not inherently bad or evil. In fact, they are essential tools for human survival and social cohesion. They allow us to return kindness, stay true to our word, look to others for guidance in uncertain times, and respect the expertise that keeps our society running. Without these mental shortcuts, the sheer volume of decisions we face every single day would be overwhelming. We would be stuck in a state of analysis paralysis, unable to move forward because every choice would require a deep dive into every possible variable. However, the central lesson of this work is that these same helpful shortcuts can be turned into weapons of influence when they are used against us by those who understand the mechanics of the human mind better than we do. We have seen how a free flower can trigger a donation we didn't want to give. We've seen how a small, signed petition can lead us to make life-altering commitments we never intended to keep. We've seen how the laughter of a recorded track or the presence of a white lab coat can bypass our critical thinking and move us toward compliance. The world we live in is not getting any simpler. On the contrary, the pace of information is accelerating. We are bombarded with more advertisements, more social media cues, and more persuasive messages than any generation before us. This means that our reliance on these primitive mental shortcuts is actually increasing. As our cognitive capacity is stretched thinner and thinner by the demands of the modern age, our vulnerability to psychological triggers grows. We are, in many ways, returning to a state of automaticity where a single trigger feature can dictate our behavior. This is why the author's message about defense is so critical. Awareness is the first and most powerful line of defense. By understanding the click that triggers our whir, we gain the ability to pause. We gain the ability to step back and ask, is this a genuine interaction, or am I being moved by a calculated psychological tactic? When we feel that sudden tightening in our gut, the stomach signs that tell us we are being trapped by our own desire for consistency, or when we feel that rush of scarcity-driven panic, we now have the vocabulary to identify it for what it is. The goal of learning these principles is not to become cynical or to stop trusting others. It is to become more discerning. It is to protect the integrity of the very shortcuts we rely on. When we call out the profiteer who uses a faked authority symbol or a manufactured scarcity deadline, we are doing more than just protecting ourselves, we are protecting the social fabric. We are insisting that the triggers we use to navigate our lives remain honest and representative of reality. In the end, Influence is a book about empowerment. It teaches us that while we may be hardwired to respond to certain triggers, we are not helpless. We have the capacity for self-reflection and the ability to reclaim our autonomy. As you move forward from this summary, I hope you carry these lessons with you. Notice when the rule of reciprocation is being invoked. Pay attention to the subtle pressure to be consistent with a past version of yourself. Look closely at the crowd before you follow it. By staying alert to these hidden strings of persuasion, you can ensure that the choices you make are truly your own. This concludes our deep dive into the psychology of persuasion. Thank you for listening, and may you find yourself moving through the world with a new sense of clarity, awareness, and agency.